So today we're looking at a video from Feminist Frequency, which is a YouTube channel hosted by famous feminist Anita Sarkeesian. In particular, we'll be taking a look at a video from her Tropes versus Women in Video Games series. This is basically a series of videos in which she complains that video games having sexy female characters is evil and oppressive or whatever. And in this video, there's a particular part of the anatomy that she takes issue with. So let's take a look at what's behind the controversy.
If you want to get to know a character, learn about their interests, goals, or desires, their butt is probably not going to give you that information. It won't tell you much about who they are or what they're thinking or feeling at any given time.
No shit.
Yeah, Anita, I don't think anyone was ever making the argument that you could glean the entirety of a person's personality and deepest thoughts and desires from their rear end. So I don't really understand why you're trying to attack this argument that nobody makes.
But video game designers often choose to put tremendous focus on the butts of certain characters, while going to almost absurd lengths to avoid calling attention to the butts of others.
Well, yeah, video game artists, or artists in general, typically do emphasize different anatomical parts on different characters differently. Like, if every single character had to be drawn and designed the exact same way, that would be kinda boring.
These carefully crafted choices developers make about camera angles and clothing significantly impact how players think about and relate to these characters.
So I can't speak on behalf of anyone else, but whenever I play a video game, I'm usually focused on, the game. Unless it's like a heavily character-driven game like Silent Hill, I usually don't put too much emphasis on trying to understand and relate with the characters.
Third-person games with female protagonists typically display those characters in a way that gives players a full-body view. A classic example of this is the original Tomb Raider games, which are presented from a third-person perspective wherein protagonist Lara Croft's entire body is visible. In these early Tomb Raider games, Lara's butt is typically right in the center of the screen.
You do realize that a lot of 3D platformer games do have this sort of camera angle with the character directly centered on screen. For example, both Mario 64 and Sonic 3D Blast utilize this camera angle, and I highly doubt the developers of those games intended to sexualize their main character.
A camera orientation which, along with the sexualized clothing the designers choose to outfit her in.
Wait, what do you mean by sexualized outfit? I mean, she's just wearing a tank top and shorts. There's nothing really overly sexual about that. It's actually rather common for girls and even men to wear a tank top and shorts when the weather gets hot.
Places a tremendous amount of emphasis on that part of her body.
You do realize that the original Tomb Raider came out in '96, right? Like, yeah, that's some sexy low-res polygon ass right there.
In dozens of third-person games with playable female characters, the character's butt is brought to the forefront.
You ever hear the expression, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail? Well, similarly, when you're a feminist, everything looks like objectification and oppression. So if a video game has a female character's butt visible, in the mind of Anita Sarkeesian, the developers of that game very clearly intended to put that derriere front and center in the spotlight, even if in reality, both the developers and the players just consider it another part of her anatomy and don't give it much thought.
And that's where the player's focus is directed.
Speak for yourself, Anita. Whenever I play a video game, my focus is directed toward playing the game. Like, if there's a hot female character in a game, I might think about it for like 2 seconds, like, okay, that's a nice ass, but then get back into the game.
In Batman Arkham City, for instance, the player's gaze is drawn to Catwoman's behind.
Really? It comes as a shock to you that Catwoman wears an outfit that's tight on her butt? Have you never picked up a Catwoman comic or piece of media ever at all? 'Cause that's the only way that could possibly come as a shock to you.
Which is emphasized by her costume and exaggerated hip sway.
Yeah, Catwoman has a very feline appearance and mannerisms. It's almost as if that's the whole point of her character. It's kind of the reason that she's called Catwoman as opposed to Foxwoman or Deerwoman or Bearwoman. Let me explain it to you in the simplest possible way I can. Catwoman wears a costume that makes her look like a cat for the same reason that Batman wears a costume that makes him look like a bat. Catwoman moves like a cat for the same reason that Spider-Man moves like a spider. Also, why aren't you complaining about Poison Ivy? I mean, when it comes to DC villains, she's actually more scantily clad and sexualized than Catwoman.
The ceremony! The Sisterhood will never forgive me if I am late.
Golden Axe Beast Rider makes extremely sure that we notice the protagonist's butt just before we take control and start playing.
Okay, I will admit it is kind of awkward how that cutscene kind of zooms in on her ass and legs, but it should still be pretty clear to anyone who understands feminism at all that she's very likely just cherry-picking games that have sexy female characters in order to try and make the case that female characters' butts are overemphasized in video games, even though a vast majority of female video game characters don't have their ass emphasized at all. Like, I bet you could just as easily cherry-pick games with attractive male characters and make the opposite argument.
And here in Tomb Raider Underworld,
I don't understand why she keeps going after Tomb Raider. I mean, of all the video games out there that sexually portray women, she chooses to fixate on this particular game, which isn't really known for involving anything sexual. I don't know if she came across a lot of R34 of Lara Croft on DeviantArt and came to the conclusion that this must be a really sexy game, but the game's about archaeology. It's about exploring ancient tombs and temples and things like that. Hence why it's called Tomb Raider and not Vagina Raider. As a matter of fact, a lot of feminists actually like Tomb Raider. The game has a female main character who's portrayed as intelligent and cunning, who's able to hold her own against enemies. It pretty much takes all the female video game character tropes and flips them on their head. So if anything, people like Anita Sarkeesian should like Tomb Raider.
to say that Lara's butt is being emphasized would be putting it mildly.
Oh yeah, this game definitely emphasizes her butt, especially when you intentionally rotate the camera so it's pointed directly at it. Also, once again, I know that she's specifically cherry-picking instances where it's particularly easy to see a female character's butt, because she chose a scene where Laura's in a swimsuit, and girl swimsuits tend to show their butts. Like, do we really need to have this conversation again? I just got done talking about a video in which a girl got in trouble because her swimsuit showed too much of her butt. Hey Anita, I think I know 2 Myrtle Beach police officers who you'd get along with just fine. They hate butts too.
Incredible. The carvings are clearly similar to early Germanic design, but this is far older than the 5th century.
Yeah, this scene where the camera pans around the inside of the tomb, and in which Laura's describing the tomb, and her butt's only visible on screen for like a second. Yeah, definitely intended to emphasize her butt.
And this happens all too often.
You can't miss it.
Again, this is how I know she's cherry-picking. Oh, a video game based on an anime has an upskirt scene. Like, gee, nobody who's ever watched anime ever could have seen that coming.
Let's contrast the way that women's butts are emphasized with the sometimes absurd lengths taken to cover up or hide men's butts.
So once again, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a feminist, everything looks like patriarchy. Just as before, she was taking the fact that female characters' butts are visible and assuming that the intention was to emphasize it, now she's kind of using the same logic but in reverse. She's taking the fact that a lot of male characters' butts tend to not be visible and assuming that they're intentionally being hidden.
If some of this footage looks jerky, that's because in some games, trying to get a glimpse of male characters' butts can feel a bit like wrestling with the camera.
Imagine playing a video game, but instead of actually playing the game, you're just sitting there fucking around with the camera to try and look at someone's ass. Like, if that's how you're choosing to spend time out of your life, you probably have some reevaluating to do.
Common ways men's butts are hidden are by preventing the player from seeing below the character's waistline, or employing a more over-the-shoulder camera angle, which has the added benefit of keeping the character's butt safely out of the frame.
So you do realize that the main character in Portal is female and out of the frame most of the time?
The most amusing solution is to simply include a cape, tunic, long coat, or very conveniently positioned piece of tattered fabric, which actively prevents the player from getting a clear or sustained look at the protagonist's butt.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
So what do you think's more likely? That there's some kind of conspiracy going on among video game developers to make sure that women's butts are visible while men's are hidden? Or, and just hear me out on this, do you think that's more likely that these designers gave their male characters capes and drapey clothing because it looks cool? Do you think maybe it was simply an aesthetic decision? Because I highly doubt it's the case that all these game artists are sitting in their studio twirling their mustaches thinking, we are going to intentionally make it that women's butts are visible and men's butts aren't, as to intentionally contribute to the objectification of women. Mwahahaha. Not to mention the fact that there's probably also a lot of female characters in gaming who also wear capes, long jackets, and tattered fabric or whatever.
For the purposes of this video, I tried to get a glimpse of Batman's rear end, but it's as if his cape is a high-tech piece of Wayne Industries equipment designed to cover up his butt at all costs.
Yeah, Batman's cape kind of makes it harder to look at his ass, because that's what capes do. They cover your back. It's really as simple as that. It would be like someone saying, man, I really want to look at the top of this person's head, but unfortunately they're wearing this hat. The hat must have some kind of advanced head-blocking technology.
I like to jokingly refer to this aspect of a male character's costume as the strategic butt covering.
What about female characters who wear capes? Or loose-fitting dresses and skirts? Don't they also have strategic butt coverings?
Of course, not all games with male protagonists keep the character's butt obscured or out of frame like these games do. The real issue is one of emphasis and definition. A significant portion of third-person games with female protagonists call attention to those characters' butts in a way that's meant to be sexually appealing to the presumed straight male player.
So, Anita, I've got some news for you. You're probably not going to like it, but it's the truth. The reason that game companies design their games with straight young men in mind is the same reason that any business designs anything any particular way, because they're looking to appeal to their primary customer base. And let's be honest, most gamers are men. That's not to say that there's no female gamers out there. There are plenty of girls who are into gaming. But historically and to this day, it's primarily a male-consumed medium. Now, Anita, if you would for a second maybe turn off your feminist tunnel vision and look at things in a more objective way instead of just cherry-picking examples that fit your narrative, you would see that there are actually quite a few video games that are primarily intended for girls. There are even quite a few games out there with sexy male characters. But these games are in the minority simply because the market for them is in the minority.
In this regard, the way that women's bodies are depicted is significantly different from the way that men's bodies are depicted.
Yeah, male and female bodies are different. Who would have guessed?
There are a few examples of male protagonists who are wearing clothing that calls attention to their butts, but for the most part, men's butts, even when visible in the frame, are de-emphasized.
Alright, so since Anita is an uber feminist, she's obviously only going to cherry pick examples that support her narrative and ignore those that don't. She's claiming there's all these video games that show girls' butts, but only very few video games that show male butts. There's actually a video by Crazy Ape. I'll link to the video in the description, but it's basically a compilation of male butts being emphasized in video games as a way to kind of prove Anita wrong. There's actually quite a few examples in the video, and the fact that Crazy Ape was able to find all these examples, while Anita could only really find one, kind of shows me that she didn't really do enough research in making this video. Which, I mean, people who don't know anything about video games talking shit about them, I mean, yeah, like that's anything new. Shocker, right?
Plenty of male heroes wear baggy pants or jeans, Uncharted's Nathan Drake among them, but nothing about his visual design or the jeans he's wearing encourages you to focus on his butt as some sort of defining aspect of his character.
So here's the thing, Anita. Video game artists, or artists in general, typically draw inspiration from the world around them. The art that an artist creates is often reflective of the world that they live in. In the society that we live in, women tend to prefer tighter clothes than men do. Women usually prefer tight clothes, men usually prefer more baggy clothes. Now, I don't know why exactly this is the case, it just is. So you're getting mad at artists when all they're really doing is just drawing inspiration from the reality that we live in. Like, if you're cheesed because women tend to wear tighter clothes than men do, don't take it out on the game artists, they didn't have anything to do with that.
By contrast, this emphasis on the butts of female characters communicates to players that this is what's important. This is what you should be paying attention to.
Again, I'm pretty sure when you're playing a video game, the thing you're supposed to be paying attention to is the game. Like, if all you want to do is jerk off to sexy female game characters, that's what DeviantArt is for.
It communicates that the character is a sexual object designed for players to look at and enjoy. And by explicitly encouraging you to ogle and objectify the character, the game is implicitly discouraging you from identifying directly with her.
So this is a very common argument made by feminists, that making a character sexy and attractive is just turning them into a sex object, and discouraging you from seeing them as a person. Which is kind of dumb, because it implies that thinking someone is physically attractive is somehow mutually exclusive with appreciating their personality. Like, it's impossible for someone to be both sexy and have a nice personality.
Strategic butt coverings and camera angles that obscure characters' rear ends are not an accident. They are a conscious decision made with great care, and the flip side of this is that designers often do the opposite when the protagonist is female.
Yeah, I'm gonna need a citation on that. Even if it is true that women's butts tend to be visible and male butts tend to be hidden in video games, you still haven't proven that this was an intentional design choice, which is ultimately what you're trying to convince us of.
This difference in how male and female characters are framed often extends into the advertisements and box covers. Women's butts are front and center, and it's even become a depressing joke that their bodies are twisted and contorted in uncomfortable or unnatural ways so that their breasts and butt can be visible in the same shot.
So here's a picture taken of a girl with both her butt and breast clearly visible in the same shot. She doesn't look uncomfortably contorted to me.
In contrast, when men are depicted from behind, there's great effort taken to cover up their rear end, often with other images or shadows.
Yeah, and I'm sure you went about your research process in a completely intellectually honest way that takes into account counterexamples as well. By the way, that Crafty Ape video that I linked to also has examples of game box art that depicts men in a sexualized way as well. So once again, she's full of shit here.
Of course, female characters can also be framed in ways that aren't objectifying.
Oh gee, look at that. It's almost when you don't cherry pick examples to make it look like there's a problem, there isn't really a problem after all.
A good example of this is the episodic adventure game Life is Strange, in which the protagonist's butt isn't emphasized or centralized. The camera angles work in conjunction with the story to encourage us to identify with her as a human being.
Okay, but let's assume for the sake of argument that that's not the case. Let's assume for the sake of argument that her butt is actually emphasized or in focus. Would this somehow make it more difficult to identify with her as a human being? Would this somehow take away all the story elements that make her character relatable? If you really are of the opinion that having a big ass makes it impossible for anyone to understand or relate to a character, then you're actually the one who's being shallow and objectifying.
Sadly, the box art for the third-person action-adventure game Beyond Good and Evil emphasizes and sexualizes Jade's butt.
Not really. I mean, her pants actually look pretty baggy. You'd think if they were trying to emphasize her butt, they'd give her tighter pants. After all, Anita, you did argue that having a character's butt visible isn't necessarily the same thing as having that butt emphasized. You made that argument, Anita.
The game itself, however, demonstrates that the Nathan Drake approach of outfitting a character in clothing that doesn't emphasize their butt and not having the camera center it or focus on it can work just as well to humanize female characters as it does for male characters.
This game pretty much has the same camera angle as that Tomb Raider game you bitched about earlier, and her butt was visible multiple times. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if her standards were just completely arbitrary for what does and doesn't count as emphasizing a butt.
So to be clear, the solution here is not to simply show more butts of male characters. Equal opportunity butt display is definitely not the answer.
Why not? I mean, men get to enjoy all this eye candy in video games, and as I've mentioned previously, there are quite a few female gamers out there as well. Maybe it's only fair that they get some fan service as well. I don't know, maybe you're onto something, Anita.
Rather, the solution is to de-emphasize the rear ends of female characters, so that players are encouraged not to ogle and objectify these women, but to identify and empathize with them as people.
So, a character having a butt makes it more difficult to identify them as people? Hey Anita, I'm not sure if you realize this, but humans have butts. Like, butts are very clearly a part of the human anatomy. If anything, it would be dehumanizing to depict someone without a butt.
This is not an impossible task, given that game designers do this all the time with their male characters. It's time they started consistently doing it with their female characters too.
So in other words, instead of just letting video game artists be creative and freely express themselves, all video games from here on out should have to comply with Anita Sarkeesian's feminist standards as to not hurt her feelings. This is what happens when you combine feminism with a lack of understanding of video games. As always, this has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Until next time, take care.